Hi, I'm Dave.
And I'm Jennifer. We're a middle aged couple with a Regal Unlimited subscription and a serious fondness for movie popcorn.
And we're going to record a video about every movie we see in 2025, or at least that's the plan.
That's the plan, and we're sticking to
If
it.
this giant pimple doesn't take over my entire head.
So, we went to the movies tonight,
Yes,
and we saw one of the
we
biggest
saw
movies of 1987.
we saw a Fathom event,
Yes, we did.
which is always exciting
Yeah,
and expensive.
it was an event. There were actually a surprisingly large number of people there.
And we went with some friends, but we went and
We
saw.
went with Nick and Alexa.
Yes. Okay, we went and saw Hellraiser,
Yes.
the 1987 horror movie, which was one of the formative movies of my youth. Viewers of this channel all know that I'm a horror writer, and absolutely Clive Barker was a huge influence on me. Clive Barker wrote and directed this film based on his short story novella called The Hellbound Heart. And it is one of those classic horror movies of the 80s. It is one of the goriest horror movies of the 80s, I would say. Jennifer does not like horror movies.
So, I did not see this movie in the 80s. I was 14, I guess, when this movie came out, and would never in a million years have gone to see it, even though I was reading horror at that time, and read horror, a reasonable amount of horror in high school and in my 20s and stuff, but would absolutely never see a horror movie. It's just too much. But I've been living with this one for a while, and watching stuff, and went to see Nosferatu that I found like not scary at all, right? So I'm like, oh, okay, well, when Nick and Alexa suggested going to see this, reissue of Hellraiser, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna be brave and I'm gonna go. And I went. And it was, I guess I don't even know now what it is that I mean when I say a horror movie, because at no point was I scared,
Okay.
right? I assume that, I guess, when I think of horror, I think of something, and when it's a movie, it's something that would be scary to me.
There's
And
one really good jump scare in this one when the Jesus statue falls out of the closet.
yeah, but I mean, she opened a closet door. Like, stuff jumps out of closet doors in a scary movie,
Yeah.
right?
You
So
didn't jump?
I don't think I
jumped.
did.
I jumped, and I've seen this movie a dozen times.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I did, but I don't know. Like, yeah, I mean, okay, that's one jump scare moment, right? But otherwise, it's gory, right? Like, you had mentioned it was body horror. I really did not realize what that meant in terms of like body horror.
Before
And
anything else,
yeah.
we should say this is going to be a spoilers one.
Yes. Oh, yes. This is wild spoilers.
Yes, for a
And
movie that's 38 years old.
yes.
And
And also really disgusting. So we will describe things that are really disgusting.
It
So
is
if
very
that's
gross.
kind of a problem, hopefully you enjoyed listening to us for 30 minutes and 30 seconds. Goodbye.
Yeah, this video might be much shorter than most of the other ones we've done.
Why do you keep saying this? It's never going to be true.
Because I always think, what are we going to talk about? And then we like just keep talking for 15, 18 minutes.
Exactly, because we talked about it on the way here.
Yes.
So like, whatever. Anywho, so
Hellraiser.
my feelings about this movie. One, in many aspects of this movie, wildly don't hold up, right? Like, it has its dynamics about female sexuality are bonkers. The styling and clothing choices and, is all very much of its moment and a time capsule of how, people looked in film in 1987, which looks dated at this point, right? But enjoyably dated because I remember that look. The special effects are amazing for what they are, right? A cheap movie in 1987. It's really very cleverly done in terms of costuming and makeup and stuff like that. Like, I totally get how if you were into horror and into the body horror aspect of it, it's incredibly well done for its moment. You know, like I just didn't need all of it.
The budget of this was $1 million for the entire film.
Yeah.
And it's crazy to think about that, what they accomplished with the practical effects. There are some non-practical effects in this movie, and they look like bad.
Yes.
They look really bad.
Sure. But they wouldn't have looked bad to me in seeing it in 1987.
I don't know.
I mean, it wouldn't have looked like amazing or like moving movies forward, but I think I would have just accepted it and not thought about it as like cheesy lightning bolt looking shit, you know? Like I think it would have just seemed normal.
All right. But the practical effects, the makeup effects especially, and there is a lot of makeup effect in this movie. Is so far beyond anything even that people are doing today.
Yeah.
And we briefly talked about this, but I had a professor in college who claimed that there was this moment in the 1980s when makeup effects, and especially gore effects in horror movies, just had this like Leonardo da Vinci moment. Like, just, you know, Tom Savini, Rick Baker, these guys from then who just made these makeup effects so much incredible beyond
Stan Winston.
So much beyond anything anybody had seen before in the movies. And that there was this splatterpunk moment in the movies that was just so shocking and really drove the horror movie genre of that time. And my professor in college said that the reason for that was that those guys had all been to Vietnam or had some exposure to the Vietnam War, and so had actually seen real violence and real gore. And so were able to then come back to Hollywood and not just splatter ketchup on people anymore, but actually show what real wounds and things looked like. And absolutely, you see that in this movie. This movie it's a study in human anatomy in a very nasty way.
Very nasty way. A lot of interest in skin and how skin tears.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you don't know the plot of this movie, and again, this is a spoiler episode, the story is about a guy named Frank Cotton and his sister-in-law, Julia, who is married to his brother. And Frank
Larry.
Cotton... Sorry?
The brother's Larry.
The brother is Larry Cotton, yeah. So Frank Cotton is a guy who is an explorer of sexual experience who finds this thing called the Lament Configuration. It's a little puzzle box.
And how do you know that it's called that?
From comic books and things.
Okay,
I don't think it's ever said in the movie.
I don't remember it being
Not
said in the movie.
Not in the first movie. But the second movie, definitely, they talk about the Lament Configuration.
Yeah.
But it's this puzzle box, and when you open up the puzzle box, these creatures called the Cenobites appear, and the Cenobites give you ultimate sexual pleasure, but also ultimate pain. And for the Cenobites, there is no difference between the two. These are creatures that have mutilated themselves. You know, you've seen at least one of them. Everybody who sees this video is going to know what I'm talking about when they say Pinhead, who is a guy who's got nails driven into his head in this very geometric pattern. Played by the amazing Doug Bradley, who it turns out was a high school friend of Clive Barker's. I had no idea. There was a little featurette after the movie where we got to see an interview with Doug Bradley. And again, incredible makeup job, but also this concept of these are not demons in the traditional sense. They're not just there to take your soul. They are absolutely offering you this sensual experience that you think you want, you really, really don't want.
You really don't. You
anyway,
really don't, because you kind of end up as scraps on the floor afterwards, literal scraps of flesh.
But almost none of that is in the movie. Very little of that is actually explained in the movie.
It's not explained, but I didn't. So what Dave is talking about is gleaned from the novella or the short story. But I actually got some of that from the film. Like, it's not as explicit as the way he's explaining it,
Mm-hmm.
but you get some of that feeling about it. And so, yeah, you know that like Frank has been torn apart by these things, and you see them even though you don't know that they're called Cenobites at that point, or like, you know, where they came, their backstory or where they came from. But by the end of the movie, you do get some of that understanding about them, even though it's never said. And they are in the movie for a surprisingly small amount of the movie. I knew the movie had something to do with these like Cenobite creatures and this Pinhead dude. And I thought they were the bad guys in the movie. But the bad guys in the movie are Frank, who, after he's been torn into little bits, ends up being oddly resurrected. They lose track of his heart, and his heart continues living in basically the old family house that Frank had been living in. And Larry and Julia come move into the house, even though it's like full of maggots
It's
and
horrible.
like disgusting. I'm like,
It is not a
bitch,
livable house.
there's maggots. Leave. I don't care what else is there. That there's something scary. There's maggots. Time to go. But so they move in and then
Accidentally
drop
drops
Larry's blood on the heart that they don't know is there.
It's in the floorboards
because it's in the floorboards
of the attic. And,
we can hear it beating, but they somehow can't.
Right. And it turns out that if it can get blood, this heart can actually reconstitute Frank's entire body.
So it needs blood and skin. And Frank and Julia have been doing it before Frank disappeared off to Cenobite land.
They didn't just do it.
They did lots of doing it.
No, so the deal is that Frank shows up for the wedding of Larry and Julia.
Right.
And seduces
fucks
Julia.
the shit out of her.
Okay. YouTube has some decorum.
Okay. Really?
Okay. So,
whatever.
Probably not that much.
Not that much.
Anyway, so
My clothes are on. Come on now.
the deal is that we'll save that for the OnlyFans. So
For the not OnlyFans.
yeah, no, that's not a real thing.
No.
So the deal is that Frank shows up for the wedding, but finds Julia alone, seduces her, and they have sex on top of her wedding dress.
Oh, that was her wedding dress.
Yes.
Oh, I didn't even register that. Okay.
So the idea is that she and Frank had this illicit affair. Torrid, and really, she fell in love with Frank, or in lust with Frank, even before she was married to Larry.
Mm-hmm.
And so now she's trying to make do with Larry, who's a complete dud of a guy. And now Frank is back. And
well, Frank as in like a skeleton with like goo on it.
Oh my God, we're
that
already
can
at
talk.
13 minutes.
Exactly. Why would you think this would be shorter, right?
Anyway, so Julia has to kill a bunch of people to bring Frank back.
Which felt oddly, the movie I've seen most recently that has that trope is Lisa Frankenstein.
Yes, exactly.
Which I'm like, okay, now I'm understanding all the references in things that I don't realize are coming from Hellraiser, right? But anyway, and it just gets more insane from there. There really is no reason for us to continue to like describe the plot. If you really want to know the plot, just like look it up, right?
But so a lot of this movie is Frank's skinless corpse.
Yes.
Coming back to life and regaining strength. And so in each scene, there's a little more of him than there was before.
Mm-hmm.
Also, Watchmen with Dr. Manhattan goes through a very similar transformation.
Oh, yeah.
Where he appears first as like nerves and bones, and then eventually gets flesh back. Mm-hmm. Definitely inspired by this. Strangely enough, there's a character in this movie who looks exactly like Alan Moore.
Yeah.
It's not Alan Moore, but it definitely looks like him.
Yeah.
Who it remains a mystery to us even after seeing the movie. Mm-hmm. I think that's intentional.
Yep.
So there's a lot of just gore in this movie. There's a lot of blood. It is, however, a really interesting story compared to most horror movies. It's not just a slasher.
Yeah.
Even Julia,
the murders have a definite purpose.
And Julia is not just a monster. Like, we get the sense that she truly does love this man on some level.
Well, see, that's the thing I would kind of argue with, right? Like, I don't think there's any real thought about her. I feel like there's real thought about Frank. Larry's daughter, who's Julia's stepdaughter, Kirsty, is in the movie, and I think there's some real thought about her. But I think Julia is like, it's just so self-evident that she would be swept up sexually by Frank, and that she would stay swept up sexually by Frank, even though Frank is a skinless skeleton and is horrific and awful. Like, she thinks for a couple of minutes about, like, yeah, murdering people for your behalf is kind of a bad thing. And then she does it. And then she enjoys it. And it, like, there isn't, I feel like she isn't real, where in some ways Frank and Larry and Kirsty are real. And I was like, okay, well, I guess you just can't see that, you know? Like,
watching it this time, I noticed there's a real generational critique in this. That Kirsty is this young woman who has either finished school or is just about to finish college and is out on her own. She wants her own apartment. She has her own job.
Well, she wants her own job, but she doesn't have her own apartment. She's rooming with this guy.
Are they roommates?
Well, she's like, I got a room. I found a room. It's with him.
You think, is that it?
Yes, they're in the same room, and they're sleeping in two different beds.
That's true.
Right?
I thought it was he was just sleeping over, and it was like a college dorm room or something.
No, at the beginning, when she's talking on the phone to Larry, she's like, oh, I found a room. I don't need to stay with you. I found a room.
Yeah, and the way that shot is framed, it's almost like it's hiding something just off frame. So that's a distinct possibility.
Yeah, so it's like she's got this roommate who is a guy who likes her.
Yeah, and they definitely get together.
They get together, but they clearly are not already fucking.
Okay.
Like, she is this, like, virginal, like, naive, wide-eyed, like, girl.
But
right?
that's the thing.
And
in a slasher movie, right, she would be the final girl, and the final girl is virginal.
Exactly.
Throughout the film.
She's a final girl.
And Kirsty is not virginal throughout the movie. She definitely sleeps with this guy.
When?
That scene when she's calling from bed and he's putting his clothes back on.
I thought they were in two different beds.
No, remember they kiss in the subway and then they go home.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that. Okay, fine, whatever. But she was rooming with him before. Yes, but still, she is definitely on the naiver end of things. And Julia is this experienced woman who is a homewrecker whore from the beginning, right? Who wrecked her own home and then wrecks all the men in the neighborhood on the behalf of the homewrecker Hobag. Yes. You know, like, okay, like, yeah, you know.
But it is fascinating. Like, Julia and Kirsty are absolutely set up as in opposition to each other. And down to the point that Julia dresses and has the hair of and looks like a star from Dynasty or Knots Landing.
Sure.
Whereas Kirsty looks like something from a John Hughes movie.
Right.
And it is absolutely fascinating to see how the two of them are styled in the movie, which I am certain Clive Barker was very much aware of and did intentionally. Because they look so completely different, these two different generations.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't they look different, right? But, like, Julia also looks like a hard-charging businesswoman who has no job, right? So she could be a seductive, 40-year-old woman because she's seducing men to come to the house who they all think they're going to get laid at lunchtime. And instead they get smashed in the head by a hammer, and then they become, Frank steals parts of their body to remake his, right? But she's not ever dressed seductively. She's dressed to go to work. But she never goes to work. Her work is to go find dudes to smack on the head with a hammer. Yeah. Like, I don't know how conscious that is, to be honest. Like, because, again, with their budget, like, how much of their budget went into costuming these women. there's clearly a ton of money into makeup and stuff, but their clothes are all clothes that you could like, find at JCPenney or find, like they're just normal people clothes at the time, right? So, the teenage early 20s girl is dressed like a teenage early 20s girl of that moment, and not a slutty version, like a normal version. And then the adult woman is dressed like in blazers and like officey kinds of clothes, which it has to be a choice because you don't have to wear a blazer to be a 40-year-old woman, right? So working women are sluts. Or it's just unconscious, right? And that's an authoritative looking woman because, she's got the shoulder pads that are 75 feet wide. Like, I kind of don't know. So I kind of don't know how to read that.
It's fascinating to me because any movie from 1987 is going to have weird sexual politics.
Sure.
Ghostbusters has weird sexual politics.
Yeah, that's a movie that just don't hold up.
Yeah.
Woof. Woof.
Okay.
On that element.
Let's do a video on Ghostbusters when we see Ghostbusters. But anyway, but this movie, it is, despite the fact that its sexual politics doesn't necessarily hold up, there's no male gaze here.
Right. Yes.
Frank is presented as a sex pest.
Yes.
Larry is presented as an absolute worthless buffoon.
Mm-hmm.
There is no like strong, even like Kirsty's boyfriend who shows up at the very last minute to save her as the house is collapsing around her. She actually pushes him out of the way
so that she can save the day.
Finish working the lament configuration and send the Cenobites back to hell. So it is really interesting because Clive Barker, I don't know if he was openly gay or known to be gay at the time, is very much now known as an absolute trailblazer in terms of horror, but also literature as an openly gay author. And I think that this movie is interesting because it does not present a gay view of these events or a queer view of these events.
Except at the beginning of this thing.
Cenobites.
Well, except through the Cenobites, but at the beginning of this movie, Frank is hot as shit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Does that make him queer?
No, but there's this, like, in that very first scene where he gets the puzzle box and then stands up, like, he's wearing a tank top for absolutely no reason in what's supposed to be a public place when, like, no one would do that in 1987.
Oh, and one of the reasons...
And very, body focused.
One of the reasons Julia agrees to go in on this horrible scheme is that she finds a bunch of photographs of him
doing it with anybody and everybody.
And is super turned on.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he's presented as a very attractive man.
Yeah.
But Julia is also presented as an extremely attractive woman.
I don't think so. And I mean, maybe it's my heterosexual self of like not reading her in the same way. But, I feel like he's a sexual being, like he's this like sex focused person before he becomes, this skinless demon who still somehow is sexy. Sexual, yeah. And saying sexual things, even though you're kind of like, ew, I don't want to touch you. But I think there's a real attention paid to his physical self as a sexy object that is not paid attention to Julia. Julia is an object of sexual desire, but I don't feel like she is a sexy object in the film.
So it's interesting because I will say that in 1987, I absolutely thought she was.
Yeah.
I thought she was the hottest thing on two legs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 2025, it's dated. It's definitely dated. Styles have changed. And she definitely looks like, a soap opera star from the 80s.
Yes.
Yeah. So, and at the time, in 1987, I thought Kirsty just looked like any other girl from my high school and was not anything special. She was kind of mousy, actually, which she's absolutely supposed to be from the story, from the novella. Okay, we should wrap this up because this is getting way out of hand. But how did you feel about this as a non-horror fan?
I felt like, seeing this 38 years after it came out, like, I understand why this is a popular foundational horror movie of its moment. Like, I do see that in it, and see how you could watch it and appreciate it in a lot of different ways. And I mean, like, I can see the Matrix coming out of it, like the visual styling of the Matrix coming out of this, right?
That's a huge inspiration on the clothes
Yeah.
that Neo and Trinity wear in the
Exactly.
Matrix.
Yeah. And, so it's like I'm putting together cultural references, right? I mean, it's like with the Lord of the Rings. I've never read the stupid Lord of the Rings, but I've read everything else and seen everything else that's derivative of it, right? So it's kind of filling that hole. Am I gonna struggle to be in my dark bedroom tonight? A little bit. Like,
Okay.
there's a couple of little teethy creatures and, like, skin rip kind of shit that, like, is probably going to come back, and that's not really necessary. So I'm not going to see Hellraiser 2. I'm not going to see Hellraiser 52 or however many of these fucking movies there are. I'm not going to see any more of them.
Okay.
But I don't regret seeing this one. Like, and I understand why it's a good horror movie, but yeah, it's just a little too much for my personal taste.
So I will say, as a horror fan, that if you do like Hellraiser and you've only ever seen the first movie, or you haven't seen any of these movies, Hellraiser itself is definitely worth watching. It's a good movie. It's got a real story to it, unlike so many slasher movies of the era, and it's got a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it also introduces these incredible characters in the Cenobites, who, like Jennifer said, are in very little of the actual footage of the movie, but absolutely steal the show every time they're on screen. There's no question about that. Nobody remembers Frank and Julia when they think about Hellraiser. They remember Pinhead. So I will say that if you're going to watch this one, watch the first one, watch the second one, Hellraiser 2 Hellbound, which expands enormously on the mythology of this movie. I would say that Hellbound is almost like it's more dark fantasy rather than horror, because it's a real fantasy story, and is a really rich document in that regard, and absolutely worth watching if you enjoyed the first one. After that, I'd probably give them a skip. They kind of go down in quality very quickly. But yeah, I think Hellraiser 1 is still really worth watching, even after all this time.
All right. Well, that's what we did.
Until next time.
All righty. Bye.
Bye.